I was able to stack up 14,300 points for search arc probes, couriers, and assessors during an electromagnetic storm on Spaceport. Now for my equipment, I tried to keep it somewhat expedition friendly. Everything here you should be able to buy from TN and Apollo with the exception of my snap hook, which you can just substitute for zip lines. I was out of the ability to create and buy zip lines, so I had to use my snap hook instead. I brought a hole cracker with 4 stacks of ammo, an anvil with 2 stacks of ammo, 4 stacks of secret grenades, a couple of light shields, 8 stacks of adrenaline shots, 2 stacks of healing items and 2 stacks of shielding items, and a photoelectric cloak. Now, if you've done open arc probes in the past, this challenge is going to feel extremely familiar because you're doing the exact same thing. You're just adding in the arc couriers with the arc probes. Now, all 3 of these give the same 286 points when you search them, including the assessors during close scrutiny. So I do recommend just focusing on the probes and the couriers. Now, I will also recommend that you use an online interactive map. I like to use Metaforge, but as a note, as I was using Metaforge, there were quite a lot of couriers that were not mapped on the Metaforge app. So it serves as a pretty good guideline for where the probes are, but just keep your eyes open for couriers that might not be marked. Now the trick here is understanding how to run your route in a way that ensures you get the most possible amount of spawns in the least dangerous areas. There's a couple of spots on this map where you're going to have a high volume of enemies, and it makes breaching the probes extremely dangerous. Now, unlike in previous seasons, in all of my runs that I've done this, I think 4 or 5 times, there are very few players that are doing it with me, which means that I was doing a lot of the breaching throughout the entire match. If you happen to get into a match where there are a lot more players that are doing this challenge, you should be able to see a much higher score potential because you don't have to spend the time breaching every container that you go to. That said, let's get into the overall strategy here. Your spawn is going to really dictate how you want to play the entire round, and the final extraction location will determine how your route should play out. Now, in previous seasons, it was pretty valuable to run around at the outside of the map, pick up the probes that were basically on the external part of the map, and then rotate in, and you could hit essentially every probe spawn location doing it that way. But because of the additional need to do a lot of the breaching and the increased volume of couriers that are added to this challenge, it's actually a bit more beneficial to stay in a higher populated area because you just have so much more value that you can get out of the probes that you're searching. While it may seem like a good idea to do a circular type of route where you essentially wrap around in one big circle, it's actually a little bit more beneficial to do a bigger zigzag pattern across the map. And you're going to have to be responsive to the enemies that are in the area. Some probes are just not going to be worth the effort, especially not bringing in something like a wolf pack to take down things like vaporizers or rocketeers or even the bastions and the bombardiers. So I do recommend accepting that you're going to have to skip some probes. Additionally, don't forget, at about 15 minutes remaining, turbines will spawn in, and turbines can really screw up some of the probes for you to be able to go and search. Now, as far as I can tell, a turbine will not aggro to you if you breach a probe that then makes a noise that attracts enemies. So as long as you're able to get to that probe without setting off any of the mines around the turbine, you can breach it safely and get those points. There are 2 overall ways that you can essentially look for the probes and the couriers. Both of them will emit the black smoke cloud from their position on the map if they have not been breached and searched. If somebody has breached, searched, and looted the container, that black smoke ceases to continue, and it will just be a probe that's on the ground with no real marker in terms of the smoke to indicate where it's at. The other way that's actually a little bit more valuable when you're trying to search for the probes and the couriers is that you can open up your map as you're running, and once you get in about 30 to 50 meters of where a probe is, an icon will appear on the map, whether you can visually see it from where you are or not. You'll find probes on the ground and on the roofs of buildings, as well as even on the top of the launch tower, but couriers will only be found essentially on the natural ground areas. So the dirt and the grass is where you're going to find the couriers. Now, in general, for how to know when you've gotten all the probes in the area is you can essentially assume that each probe that you find has 2 other probes in the vicinity that maps to a single group of probes in that area. This does not apply to couriers, so just keep that in mind as I'm explaining this. Now, I'm going to bring up the interactive map here for a second just to give a couple examples of what I mean. So take outside of fuel control as an example. As you can see on the interactive map, there's about 5 different probe locations that are marked here. In general, in this small area of probes, there will be 3 probes out of the 5 randomly placed somewhere in that zone. As long as you've found 3 arc probes in that general area around fuel control, you can feel confident that you've gotten all the probes in that location and continue moving on to the next. Now, couriers don't seem to fit into that same box. They are just a little bit more random and scattered throughout the map. You can find some that are in one-offs, you can find some that are close together with another one, but it's not as consistent as the probes. Now, as you are breaching each of these, the benefit of the courier is the couriers do not make an audible noise that will then attract enemies. So you can breach these in a little bit more risky positions. As long as you're not within eyesight of the enemy and they're not close to you, you can breach those without fear of pulling that aggro. Now for the probes, once you start to breach them, they'll begin to emit a noise that will attract enemies in the nearby area. I can't give an exact number, but somewhere around the 75 to 80 meter mark is when you're safe to breach a probe and you won't pull something like a vaporizer or a rocketeer to your position. Now the other smaller flying arc enemies are a little bit more aggro prone, and they will aggro from, I feel like, a little bit further away, especially the spotters. So just keep an eye out for that and listen for when the enemies have aggroed to you. Now, since a lot of you are coming in with essentially an expedition loadout, what I recommend that you do, because there is such a high volume of probes placed everywhere on the map, is just accept that some probes are going to be too dangerous for you to get to and just ignore that zone of probes. Now, the caveat to that is you definitely have to be aware of where probes aren't spawning. So in general, like I was saying earlier, each probe has a group of probes that it essentially belongs to. And there's maybe 20 to 30 different distinct groups of probes that are spawned in randomly when this match begins. Now, every match, a few of those groups will just not spawn in. And it essentially means that every time you do a match, you're going to find a slightly different variation of the probe spawns. And that's just because of the RNG. That's nothing that you can control. So if you get to an area like the departure building and you don't find a probe anywhere on top of the departure building or anywhere nearby, you can assume that that is one of the zones that is just not spawned for that round. And you can confidently move into the next space knowing that there's just no probes there, and you will have a higher chance at the next zone having the probes. Once you've come across the 2 to 3 zones of not having probes, you can feel pretty confident that the remaining groups will all have their probes. And now lastly, just to be clear, you earn points from the search, not from the breach. So you can come by probes and couriers that are already opened, search the container super quick, and then move on to the next. It actually creates a little bit of a benefit for players that are able to just search the container and not have to breach, because you can keep moving to the next probe and stacking up your points. Now, outside of that, there really isn't a ton more to this challenge. It really is just a process of trying to avoid as much danger as possible, breaching and searching the probes, and stacking up your points. Once you've stacked up enough points and you're happy with your score, head back to Speranza, collect any loot if you haven't already, and watch your score fly up the leaderboard. That's going to be it for me today, y'all. Thanks for watching. Now, this is going to be a shorter form video, but if you want to see the full run, I'm going to pin a comment to this video with a link to the full playthrough. I'm currently dealing with an issue on my PC where when I render out longer form videos, it takes a substantial amount of time because for whatever reason, my editing platform will only render on the CPU and won't render on the GPU. So I'm just going to upload the separate capture as an unlisted video and link it directly to this one so you can review that path if you want.